Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John Reeve and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second session of the King Hall Naval History Conference. The theme of this session is Local Action and Global Influence, the diplomatic impact of naval tactics and operations in their design and execution. We have a distinguished panel of international speakers for you, and we also have some impressive budding talent at the postgraduate level, which I think bodes well for the study of naval history and related subjects in Australia. I'll introduce each of our speakers in turn as we go, but I'm very pleased indeed to be able to welcome the first speaker this afternoon, which is Mr. Nick Childs, who has come a very long way to speak to us this afternoon. Some of you may know he spent many years as a BBC correspondent in different parts of the world. He is currently the Naval and Maritime Expert and Authority for the ISS in London. I might add that his book on Britain's future navy, which came out several years ago, is not only a very good read, but contains various observations and reflections on which are relevant not only to the British Navy, but also to other medium navies such as Australia. And we are looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say to us this afternoon. Please welcome him. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for that generous introduction, and thank you also to the organisers for inviting me to come and speak at this event. I'm honoured and not a little humbled because not only is it my first time at this gathering, but it's also the first time I've actually set foot on Australian soil. So for me, it's a long overdue ticking of a personal box. I'm also somewhat daunted, conscious that we've already had on display today at this gathering a significant amount of expertise. And while I read history, I'm not a professional historian. So with all that in mind, I hope you will give me latitude for that. My approach in terms of the title given for this session is to interpret it as the strategic drivers and impact of decisions on force composition and deployment, as well as decisions at the tactical and operational level. In the contemporary lexicon, we would talk about force and operational posture and force levels, tasking priorities, command and control, stationing, rules of engagement, the dilemmas of early and light deployment versus later and heavy, and latterly, of course, the significant and important elements, close to my heart, I suppose, of media profile and information effect. Now, Geoffrey Till, in his great opening keynote, offered the cautionary injunction not to try to learn too much from what was a very different world. Nevertheless, I will kick off reflecting that in 2005, when he was new into the job of Chief of Naval Operations, then Admiral Mike Mullen stated that for him, perhaps the most enduring trademark of effective sea power was influence. That may not sound particularly original, but it came at a time of much discussion about how to grapple with ever more stretched resources. And there was a lot of talk about virtual presence. And quite memorably to my mind, Admiral Mullen coined the phrase that for him, virtual presence is actual absence. I think in the context of now, as we debate the implications and opportunities presented by innovative technology and emerging technologies, it's absolutely right and necessary to embrace those, but it is equally necessary not to assume that they can substitute for every shortfall like presence, and what presence really means, and how one seeks to achieve influence. It's also absolutely necessary to keep in mind who one is trying to influence: one's own public, the enemy or opposition, or allies and friends. It's often all three. The danger is when one of these becomes overemphasized at the expense of the others, mainly, dare one say it, usually trying to impress one's friends. Maybe the shorthand for what this boils down to is what we can learn from the past to inform ourselves now about what it means to employ gunboat diplomacy in the 21st century. Because I'm conscious of the expertise that is in this room, and having heard some of it deployed already, I was anxious to aim off slightly in terms of the case studies that I'd like to talk about. So there are three, and the first one I'd like to talk about is the experience of the British Pacific Fleet from 1944 to 1948. Second, and it's already been mentioned, the 1982 Falklands conflict. And thirdly, again, it's already come up briefly in passing, the recent events in the Gulf, but perhaps more particularly the tanker war of the 1980s. Regarding the British Pacific Fleet, it had a difficult birth, it had considerable growing pains, and the way in the end it was deployed and employed were of considerable strategic significance. It was, of course, and again we heard about this morning, it was born out of disaster. Perspectives play a big part in all of this and in the theme that we're discussing. In his recent book on the subject of the British Pacific Fleet, David Hobbs calls it the Royal Navy's most powerful strike force ever. And in terms of deployable force, he's probably justified. Yet in terms of the then ballooning US Navy Pacific juggernaut, the Pacific Fleet, as it was eventually constituted 4 battleships, 6 fleet carriers, 9 other smaller carriers, 11 cruisers, and scores of other warships. It was designated in US Navy terms rather more modestly as Task Force 57 or 37, depending on whether it was deployed with the 5th or 3rd Fleets, and it may not, strictly speaking, even have deserved that, as it was more nearly equivalent to the then US Navy task group. Likewise, there are different perspectives and judgments on its operational impact. There were initially differences in London over the commitment of the British Pacific Fleet and where the focus of the British effort should be. There was, of course, discouragement and scepticism from the United States, chiefly in the shape of the then Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King. This led to King's insistence, when he was in the end overruled that the fleet would be deployed, that it should be self-sufficient. But because of the overarching strategic importance of the deployment, that stipulation in itself was, in the end, rather liberally interpreted. So, the British Pacific Fleet was established officially on the 22nd of November 1944, and it's another one of those 75th anniversaries that we're approaching. The core of heavy units were British, but it also included warships from Australia, Canada and New Zealand, and there were many more Commonwealth sailors and particularly significantly Commonwealth airmen serving in the fleet. There was, of course, the Herculean effort put into creating the fleet train and other support needed to sustain the operation and the role decided upon within a US Navy construct. Shortcomings were exposed, but it delivered enough. The tactical and operational results earned sufficient respect from the United States, and there were some notable operational features, not least the resilience displayed by the British armored-decked aircraft carriers in the face of Japanese kamikaze attacks. Above all, it was the chief military effect that helped to earn the British a place at the diplomatic top table in the closing stages of the Pacific War. And in terms of the critical elements, as far as the themes we're talking about, one of them was, in terms of overall effect, I suppose that delivered by the command and control arrangements within the British Pacific Fleet, first of all, with split between the strategic and the diplomatic, high-level versus the operational between Admiral Fraser and Vice Admiral Rawlings, and also the BFP's fitting in to the constructs of both the 5th and the 3rd Fleets under US command. And secondly, the ability to adapt to a point at least the capabilities of the US Navy, particularly in terms of carrier-based offensive strike operations. The legacy of the operational experience probably also helped when it came to the Commonwealth contribution to UN forces in the Korean War a little bit later. Of course, in the longer term, it also sowed the seeds of doubt in Britain about the ability and the cost effectiveness of sustaining the presence, and particularly the naval presence, east of Suez. And perhaps not entirely in a linear way, but there are links through the fallout from the east of Suez decision and the scrapping of the Royal Navy's then new generation of large aircraft carriers that took us and take us to the events of the South Atlantic in 1982. As an aside, given that this is a history conference, when I was chatting to James Goldrick about the fact that I was going to mention and reference the Falklands, he pointed out that we are now further away from and further distant from the Falklands historically than the Falklands was from the end of the Second World War, which is one of those rites of passage moments that we should reflect on. But there are also some enduring aspects of that confrontation that are relevant to this topic, particularly in terms of the issues such as force levels, operational posture, and rules of engagement that I mentioned earlier. So the first of these I would like to bring up, and I think it's probably a fairly well-known key point of the Falklands campaign, was, if you like, the flip side of the impact and the potential strategic impact of single ship deployments or commitments in a strategic context, and that is the decision to withdraw the ice patrol ship HMS Endurance, which was seen as a signal of commitment, or rather a lack of commitment, in Buenos Aires. Of course, what's unfolded then as a result of that judgment can't be completely divorced from the domestic politics of Argentina at the time, in terms of the interpretation that they put on it. But nevertheless, a key element of the construct in the unfolding events of the South Atlantic. Secondly, Jeff also spoke about the importance of manoeuvre, and the actual deployment of the Royal Navy task force, I think, illuminates this, and it was a very public deployment. First, its departure as a statement of national intent, and then the pace of the passage south, also providing a window for the pursuit of, albeit ultimately unsuccessful, diplomatic negotiations. Again, number 3, and this is a somewhat ambiguous point, but it goes to the issue of the impact of operational level constructs. But in terms of the unfolding of the campaign, the British declaration of an exclusion zone, and then as a first significant act in the actual campaign, to sink a major warship, the General Belgrano, outside that exclusion zone. For all the caveats around what the exclusion zone actually meant and what it didn't mean, this created a huge degree of diplomatic and political fallout, albeit that it also had the profound and indeed game-changing operational effect of forcing the Argentine surface fleet out of the equation. And in the end, that was perhaps more decisive. Fourth, finally, the fact that the dispatch of the task force against expectations was a significant game changer, a force that was not really designed for such a mission, but rather more redesigned post the East of Suez as an open ocean anti-submarine force against a very different enemy. But it retained just enough capability and just enough skills and training to prevail despite significant losses, and in the end, for that reason, had an enduring and perhaps significant strategic effect. One other, and again, this is an arguable point, but I think it is important in the context of things to consider, and that is on the issue of operational design and execution. The potential option that there might have been for direct strikes on the Argentine mainland as part of the British campaign, it's a moot point as to whether there was a real capability to do that, but the fact that the operational campaign was essentially, apart from one aborted special forces attack, was confined to the operational area of the Falklands. It raised the risk calculus for the task force itself, but it greatly eased the diplomatic choreography of the crisis as far as the United Kingdom is concerned. And that issue of the limitations, the operational constructs and the limitations that can provide, significant diplomatic effect. It's interesting that the parallel I'm drawn to is the recent events in the Gulf and the escalation ladder of deterrence and escalation in the equation as far as rules of engagement are concerned, with the non-response of the United States ultimately to the shoot down of the US BAMS-D unmanned aerial vehicle. But for that constraint and restraint, we might be in a whole different scenario right now in terms of tensions there in the Gulf. To expand on the Gulf point, and again Jeff mentioned this morning, the contemporary challenges now faced by the individual surface combatant commanders that may or may not be tasks over coming months with the prospect of an enhanced maritime security operation or enhanced maritime security operation in and around the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The tactical nightmare that today could confront those frigate captains in the Straits of Hormuz and around the Straits of Hormuz is probably of an order of significance greater than took place 30 years ago with the tanker war. A lot of echoes have been ascribed to the tanker war of 30 years ago, and people have immediately leapt to that as a history signaller. But there are enduring but also significant discontinuities in terms of that particular scenario. It was on a very different scale in lots of ways. It was as a result of a very enduring campaign between two regional powers that spilled over into the seas, particularly in the latter parts of the 1980s in the Iran-Iraq War. In total, there were something like 450 attacks altogether. Missiles were flying everywhere. So we're talking about a scale of confrontation that what we see now is not even approaching. And as I say, while there are some enduring elements to that, there are significant discontinuities. The force balances, if you like, between the conventional capabilities in terms of maritime security that the UK and Western forces have compared to the comprehensively enhanced asymmetric capabilities that the Iranians have are a significant difference. And yet, one of the key elements to the response has been that the Royal Navy in particular, I believe, but I dare say others also, have been dusting off the logbooks from the 1980s of individual commanders and going back and talking to them, because just the small elements of ship positioning, tactical awareness, tactical positioning of escorts accompanying tankers and other merchant ships through the Gulf. Those are lessons that in some ways have atrophied and been lost and are now having to be relearned as a result of the renewed tensions and confrontations. Albeit that in the end, what's happening at sea is a symptom of a bigger problem, but nevertheless it potentially could be an enduring problem that will need an enduring set of lessons learned. And in that context, it is another reminder of those very tactical elements that are in the midst of time in many ways, but have been revived in terms of particular maritime tactical considerations. More broadly, and returning to the issue of the British Pacific Fleet, the legacy of that, there is resonance in terms of, for both the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy, as they each of them clamber back into the business of task group operations, not least in the Indo-Pacific region, and whether that is wise in the case of the former as far as regional ambitions out to this part of the world is concerned, that I think is a matter of debate, but the British Pacific Fleet offers lessons in terms of that construct, that coalition effort, and fitting into that in either a supplementary or a leadership role. It's not the only example, and Peter Jones pointed out some other examples of that as well this morning in his remarks, as far as the complex operation of significant formations in a bigger whole. One element of that is relearning those arts of significant formation deployment, as opposed to the singleton deployments in a complex, demanding and rapidly evolving coalition architecture, and being ready to do so either in a supporting or potentially a leadership role. It is the capability in that sense to provide a significant element of something bigger. But if that is potentially the wow factor of diplomatic or strategic effect, there is also the other end of the spectrum, the concept of the strategic frigate or corvette, if you like, that can deliver effect at a somewhat lower level, but to do so day in, day out, to be equipped to do so, both in terms of capabilities and skills, in the mould of the master and commander, if you like, perhaps isolated and out of touch. In terms of strategic effect there, persistence can outweigh potency. The Royal Navy may be facing that dilemma now, right now, in how it's preparing its people and its forces about to deploy its first operational aircraft carrier task force in a long time, perhaps out to this region, to get into the mindset of being an aircraft carrier navy again, performing at that potential level, just at the same time as it's dusting off those old logbooks from the tanker wars of the late 1980s to deal with a potentially even more complex tactical picture with a balance of forces significantly less favourable than it was 3 decades ago. And in data terms, the numbers are such that in 1987, the Royal Navy had as its resource in responding to the tanker war 50 destroyers and frigates. Today it has 19. So already there is the potential for it to be pulled out of shape as it tries to grapple with this, these differing spectrums of capability. But then maybe, and I'll finish here, maybe the solution there, even in that maritime context, is now to be, in the phrase that's certainly common in the UK at the moment, to be international by design and inevitably also by training. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Some stimulating thoughts there, definitely, on the diplomatic and strategic legacies of naval operations and tactics. Our next speaker is Dr. David Kohnen. He is a retired commander in the US Navy, and he is the director of the John Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Research at the US Naval War College at Newport, which is a very important post in terms of the promotion of naval studies, both in the United States and more widely. He has written extensively on 20th century naval history and on more contemporary naval strategic issues. Please welcome him.
So go to the next slide, please. So in very broad strokes, in 10 minutes or less, I'm going to talk to you today about the gentleman that you see on the screen today, Ernest J. King. During the Second World War, Ernest J. King inherited the responsibility for a war of unprecedented scale. There was no manual on how to do this job that he inherited after the disaster of Pearl Harbor. But from 1941 to 1945, King held unprecedented authority as the Chief of Naval Operations, as well as a job that was known at the time as Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet, which in the U.S. Navy was called SINCUS by the acronym. Of course, after getting the job following Pearl Harbor, King said, that's not the title I want to carry. And so he changed the acronym to COMINCH. So during the Second World War, King's actual title was COMINCH during World War II. So by studying historical figures like King, contemporary naval thinkers can gain a fresh perspective on the transcendent challenges inherent with sustaining operations in the global maritime arena, whether it's in peace or in war. Considering the historically unprecedented scale of operations in the Second World War, Admiral King drew from his unique experience of over 40 years in uniformed service. He inherited a job, by the way, that was very difficult because in the context of Allied operations, there was a gentleman named Winston S. Churchill whose desired end state in the Second World War was the restoration of the British Imperial Order. And of course, Ernest King's boss was actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had a completely separate vision of what the desired end state was in the Second World War. Roosevelt wanted to create something, a utopian sort of dream called the United Nations. So King had these two, sort of different perspectives on what the global war was all about. In many respects, King drew from his own experience to navigate through these uncharted waters. In particular, the First World War was very important to King's understanding of global warfare. Coordinating operations within the Admiralty planning staff, King did gain an appreciation for the British perspective in how they conducted operations during the First World War. Among other key observations, King concluded that the Royal Navy, quote, relied too heavily upon a global network of bases ashore, which proved vulnerable and required defensive land and air forces. Drawing lessons from the First Great War, King thought that naval bases ashore actually sapped resources from the fleet at sea. Rising through the ranks in the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s, King trained his forces to operate with limited access to bases ashore. He developed plans for a global network of supply and mobile logistics to sustain operations at sea without access to bases ashore. King developed the concept of amphibious warfare during studies at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. They figured out that what you need is a massive amount of ships that are cheap to build and often commanded by very junior ranking officers. The ship that won the Second World War is not the battleship or the aircraft carrier, maybe not even the submarine. It was the LST. The LST is what enabled King to coordinate global operations and enable the armies to get to where they needed to go to win the Europe First concept. On questions of Anglo-American grand naval strategy, King wanted to use the Chinese and Soviet armies as the main means to defeat the Axis powers ashore, as the Allied navies would provide the sea power capability to sustain those operations. King criticized efforts to support land-focused, quote, fringe strategies that sapped resources from the prime strategic objectives. King explained, quote, Mr. Churchill had an army view of the world and did not like the word, quote, logistics. Churchill insisted that the King's English had no such word. Whenever King used the term during meetings of the combined chiefs of staff, Churchill always barked across the table, logistics, what is that? The Europe First principle required King to balance the available resources that the U.S. Navy could bring to bear against the Axis tripartite on the global stage. One of the problems in the historiography is we tend to focus only on individual theaters or individual actions. to truly understand the strategy of the Second World War, we have to take the global maritime approach, which is what Ernest King enables us to do. Although Allied forces suffered miserable losses in the early bloody battles, such as at Guadalcanal, we have to understand the context of why those campaigns were conducted. In that context of 1942, the objective was to lure the Japanese to focus on the farthest reaches of the Pacific to enable the mobilization of American industry and, of course, military and naval forces. King's attitude about relations with the British is captured in a letter to his friend Harold Rainsford Stark, where he complained, quote, "The seeming helplessness of our cousins strikes me as amusing when it is not annoying. I am sure that what they would wish in their hearts is that we would haul down the stars and stripes and hoist the white ensign on all of our ships." King concluded, "I cannot be expected to agree to help them cling to tasks that they themselves say they are unable to do unless we lend them our ships and other forces." King explained to FDR, quote, "The Royal Navy knows too little about logistics and naval aviation. The United States would have to get supplies for them, and that would take 6 months to get anything out of them." During a meeting with Winston Churchill, Churchill said to King, "We want to get into the Pacific as well." And King said, "Yes, of course, but at the right time." Churchill insisted, "We want to get into the Pacific immediately." This is in 1944. King said, "Absolutely not. You don't have the same logistical doctrine that we do, and it's impossible for us to support you." Churchill then responded to King sheepishly. He said, "Yes, but the Royal Navy wants to have a little fun too with the Japanese." British colleagues in the Combined Chiefs of Staff recognized King as the key strategist in the global war at sea. The first Sea Lord, Sir Andrew Cunningham, described King as, quote, "a man of immense capability and ability, quite ruthless in his methods. He was not an easy person to get on with, but on the whole, I think Ernest King was the right man in the right place. Not content with fighting the enemy, he was usually fighting someone on his own side as well." In the Anglo-American duels over global strategic priorities on the Combined Chiefs, Field Marshal Lord Allenbrook later noted the tough and stubborn King, the old crustacean, as his countrymen called him, the ablest strategist on the Combined Chiefs of Staff. With these very, very brief observations, I will close by offering the following. The Anglo-American naval strategy of the Second World War reflected the compromises required to sustain offensive operations against the Axis tripartite. Following the historic traditions of Britannia in the global maritime arena under the banner of multinational collaboration, the American variant of a King's Navy grew out of the turmoil of the Second World War. From an American perspective, the maintenance of multinational naval collaboration in the maritime arena remains crucial to our collective objectives to avert the prospects of future war through sea power into the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and for that very interesting and helpful reminder that there are grand strategic implications of the widest kind in naval operations and strategy, and for that helpful reminder that all grand strategy is essentially maritime, something I've always thought is underlined by the fact that the wall maps in the cabinet war rooms in London from the Second World War are all not of bodies of land, but of large bodies of water. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Dunley, and he is lecturer in history at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, at ADFA, the Australian Defence Force Academy in Canberra. And Richard has written and researched fairly widely on early 20th century British naval and strategic policy. On a personal note, I'm delighted to say that he also has recently succeeded me in teaching naval history at the Academy, which means that the program is in very good hands. Richard.
Thank you, John. Thank you to the Sea Power Centre for inviting me to speak. This paper today is going to look at British plans during the interwar period to use economic warfare to exert pressure on Japan in the event of war. You're probably wondering why I'm talking about this, and I think it's interesting for 3 reasons. Let's see if we can get this to work. How do we go forward? Nope. There we go. It concerns how a global naval hegemon, somebody that can exert global power, prepares to fight against a strong regional power which perhaps can prevent that global naval hegemon from operating as it would like within the regional sphere. Secondly, it explores how you can go beyond the exercise of naval power to consider the broader factors involved in exercising what I would refer to as sea power. And I think this is a really important distinction to make. And thirdly, and perhaps crucially, the reason why this particular period is interesting is because these people knew what they were doing. They had all done this before. The men who were developing this planning had fought the First World War and had real-world, real-life experience of how to do this particular job. And as such, I think it's worth paying attention to what they came up with. Okay, so as we all know, British naval strategy against Japan was centred on what's called the Singapore strategy. What is less commonly known about the Singapore strategy is the way in which it sought to effectively end this conflict. We normally think about the Singapore strategy in relation to the defence of Singapore, the defence of Malaya, the defence of Australia. But of course, this strategy wasn't solely a defensive strategy. They thought about how they could actually end this conflict. And the tool they would use to do this was economic warfare. The main objective of the British strategy, as set out in the 1923 War Memorandum, was to bring economic pressure to bear by instituting worldwide measures which would have for their object the severance of her sea communications wherever possible. This is how you use global power to exert and ultimately force a belligerent to its knees. And that is what they're looking to do. So the Singapore strategy effectively starts with the transfer of the main British fleet out to Singapore, and then the ideal is that the fleet then moves on up to Hong Kong, and then after a period of consolidation either at Singapore or Hong Kong, can then push on into Japanese home waters and hopefully fights a nice decisive battle, defeats the Japanese fleet, and that then will enable British control of the seas around Japan. Once you have British command of the seas in the waters around Japan, you can then begin to sever the lines of communication. And this sets out the key trade routes, Japanese trade routes, as they were seen by the British at the time. You've got those with Korea, those with mainland China, the Trans-Pacific route with the United States, the route into the Indian Ocean, and south, what's known as the Australasian trade route. These are the key connectors which link the Japanese economy into the world system. And that is what the British ultimately needed to sever. The problem from the British perspective was that this was the ideal situation. They realised pretty quickly that it wasn't likely to happen. On a basic level, what happens if the Japanese don't come out to fight? In the 1920s, the idea was that the British would be manage to deploy an overwhelmingly powerful or considerably more powerful fleet. Why would the Japanese come out and fight against a more powerful fleet? Why would they not retain their fleet as a fleet in being? And because of the distance that the British would be operating from, it would be very difficult for them to exert any kind of meaningful control over Japanese waters in the face of a major fleet in being. The British knew this. As they move into the 1930s, it becomes clear the British are not going to be able to send as powerful a fleet into Japanese waters or into the Far Eastern waters, and as such, their ability to ever even force a decisive battle, let alone win one, becomes questionable. Furthermore, you've got increasing Japanese, what we would refer to now as A2AD, growth of Japanese land-based naval aviation, strengthening Japanese submarines and mine warfare, all of which will prevent the British potentially from operating in this crucial environment around Japan. So the question which ultimately British planners had to face is, how can you exert pressure against Japan when you can't meaningfully get into and control this sphere of influence? And that is the real problem that they face. And the answer that the British come up with, and that they develop systems to try and implement, is to go global and to exploit the advantages that Britain has as a global power, and exploit the full range of resources and options that come not merely from British naval strength, but from its commercial, its legal, its diplomatic, its financial, and all of these, its shipping strength, all of these other capabilities that exist within the broader British Empire world system that still kind of exists in the interwar period. So, the first step in doing this is to close off trade with the British Empire. The British Empire at this point is still a very large economic power and has considerable trade and resources. So you need to firstly close down your own people supplying the enemy. Then you set up patrols to try and cut down contraband. The key patrols at this point are considered to be the straits, the archipelagic straits in the Dutch East Indies, and this particular route off the west coast of the United States. That is a real issue because it's just so big. But that's one of the things that we can think about. The next step is to set up what are called contraband control bases. And the four key ones that they're looking at here are Aden, Durban, Port Stanley, and Jamaica. These are really spread out. But what they do is they control the sea routes into the broad Indo-Pacific basins through the Suez Canal, the Cape of Good Hope, Cape Horn, and the Panama Canal. If you can close off trade through those points, you can stop, basically you can cut off the rest of the world from the Indo-Pacific basins, and that's the aim. Now, it's important to remember that this is not the second half of the Second World War. And I say this because I think all too often we look at high-intensity conflict and planning for high-intensity conflict through the lens of that particular period, when the environment was such that there were very few neutrals and there was very little regard left for international law. This is not the situation which the British are planning for in the 1930s, or which they had any real experience with. And in this situation, naval power is not enough. They needed to exert sea power. And as they learnt during the First World War, the exertion of sea power is a whole-of-government effort. Now, the British split this up into three broad categories in terms of economic weapons or economic warfare. You've got legislative, diplomatic, and military. So far, I've only really talked about the third of these, military, which in many respects is the least important. From 1919 onwards, 1919 sees the end of the Allied blockade committee is shut down. Within weeks, the First Lord of the Admiralty is petitioning Cabinet to set up a new committee to examine how they're going to do this again. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, there are a series of very high-powered interdepartmental committees looking at how you put in place measures to run economic warfare across the whole of government. In terms of legislative steps, the primary sort of role of this kind of legislative measure is to stop British goods and British services getting to the enemy, whether that's physical goods or things like credit. This is quite difficult. How do you control your own people? And ultimately this comes down to things like this, which is a draft of the Trading with the Enemy Act from the 1939 War Book. The British had the legislation ready to go. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and as soon as war broke out, they had everything ready and they could simply hit the play button, as it were. So they begin to prepare methods and means to stop trading with the enemy. There's a lot more that goes on up behind the scenes behind this, but I don't really have time to look into that. Diplomatic, and this is perhaps the most difficult of these. This is primarily means of stopping neutrals trading with the enemy. It can take numerous forms, from buying up of goods through to stopping the enemy getting shipping to get the goods to them, all the way through to rationing of imports of neutrals. I'll take one very quick example. One way you can stop shipping is through stopping neutral shipping getting coal or fuel. So the British set up a bunkering committee in the 1920s, which examines all of the ports in the Indo-Pacific region, all 33 major ports where they can, neutral shipping can potentially get fuel. They work out what fuel supplies there are there of coal and oil fuel, where those ports get those fuel supplies from, and the methods by which they can exert pressure on the ports which aren't within the British Empire to stop them giving any neutral ships coal if those neutral ships are going to Japan. So they set up all of these means to firstly know what's going on and then try and exert pressure. Finally, all of these measures rely massively on intelligence. You need to know what's happening in the global trading system to be able to exert influence over it. And so the British begin to reintegrate intelligence into this trading system. And this includes very dull stuff like a collection of massive amounts of statistics. So by the late 1920s, the British have effectively set up a shadow Ministry of Blockade, drawing on numerous different government departments, and which is ready to go in the event of war. Now, how effective this would have been is a matter of some debate, and a lot would have depended on the attitude of the United States as the key neutral power. But they were preparing and they were ready to do this. The British never got to fight this war, at least not in the way they ever expected. The situation from 1937 onwards in Britain and in the Far East, in Europe and in the Far East, meant that the geostrategic assumptions behind this never actually came about. During the Second World War, the United States exploits many of the weaknesses which the British see within the Japanese economic system, but they do so in a very different way and using a very different set of means. But I would hazard to say that this does not mean that the planning which the British developed in this particular case is either incorrect or without value to those thinking about how you might want to exert sea power today. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for that well-studied and informed case study of economic warfare, which reminds us that naval operations as a function of true sea power take place in a whole-of-government context. Our next speaker is Nicole Townsend, and Nicole is a PhD candidate at UNSW Canberra, and her current research concerns the Mediterranean theatre in the Second World War, and it promises to provide significant new revisions of our understanding of that campaign. Nicole.
Okay. Thank you, John, and to the Sea Power Centre for inviting me to speak today. In keeping with the conference's theme, I will be using the Second World War as a case study to demonstrate the interconnected and jigsaw puzzle-like nature of the war, and how local events can have global implications. While the First World War is so named, the Second World War was a truly global conflict. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain and its empire fought in all corners of the world. The navies battled for mastery of the seas in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Armies fought across Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific, and the air forces flew operations across each of these theatres. The war against Germany and Italy is often distinguished quite clearly from the war against Japan. From an Australian perspective, the war in the Pacific has at times been termed the real war, and depicted as the fight for Australia. On the other hand, the British priority is often viewed in relation to the Europe First strategy. Events in the Pacific and European theatres, for example, are considered disparate given their significant geographic separation. However, these theatres cannot be so easily separated simply by geography, and the Second World War is a prime example of how events in one area can substantially affect those in another distant theatre. Today I will focus on the logistic and economic foundations of the British war effort and the implications these had for the war at sea and naval support. This was a technological war, but victory was also grounded in resources and the belligerents' abilities to maintain extensive supply lines. While the Axis forces also struggled to maintain logistical networks and supplies of raw materials, this was particularly important for Britain and its empire as it relied heavily on its far-flung empire to source various raw materials and supply its war effort with the men and material it needed. Men had to be shipped across the oceans to the battlefront, and the ships which carried them required fuel to make the journey, fuel which itself was sourced from various points across the world. All of this relied on the ability of the Commonwealth navies to maintain these networks. The effect of this was twofold. The defence of sea lanes without which the Empire and indeed the Allies could not have fought the war as they did became critically important. Second, this reliance on a vast, largely maritime, global-scale supply network meant that an event in one region could have significant implications for other sections of the network. One of the prime examples of this, and the one I will briefly explore today, is that of the supply of oil and rubber products, both of which were intrinsically linked to the Allies' ability to wage war. Though it has been established that the Japanese never intended to launch a full-scale invasion of Australia, at the time the fear of such a threat was very real, especially in remote areas of Queensland and Western Australia. Instead, the Japanese planned to isolate Australia by interdicting the main Pacific supply lines to America in the east and across the Indian Ocean to Britain in the west, by taking such places as the Andaman Islands, Samoa and Fiji. With time, it was believed that this would force Australia out of the war through a sheer lack of resources and stop the US from using Australia as a launch pad for Pacific operations. Had this plan succeeded, the Allies would have been forced to divert merchant shipping through safer waters, thereby extending the time taken to make each run and in turn lowering logistic capacity. For example, with the fall of Singapore and the Japanese invasions of Malaya, Borneo and particularly Dutch East Indies between December 1941 and March 1942, the Imperial War effort lost its primary sources of key raw materials such as rubber and oil. Australia was directly affected by this, as in 1941 alone it had imported from the Dutch East Indies over 250 million gallons of oil. Though these were localised events, and they did not directly affect the war in Europe, they did have an indirect impact on multiple theatres. Part of the general Japanese sweep through Southeast Asia, these events brought war to the Pacific, but they also repositioned British imperial naval power at Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, which became the main base for British naval power in the Eastern Theatre. In turn, they also intensified the pressure on the Allies to hold the position in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, as the loss of oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies made Iranian, Iraqi and Persian Gulf sources more important, for these became the basis of the British and Australian war efforts in the Pacific. The Abadan refinery in Iran, for example, was the sole source of 100-octane aviation fuel required by the air forces, at least until the formulation of artificial cumene in the United States in 1942 onwards. In one message sent to the Australian government after it requested the return of troops to Australia in 1942, Churchill noted that up to 60% of Middle Eastern oil supplies were sent to the Pacific Theatre, and specifically to Australia. Maintaining a supply of rubber was also important, as it was used in almost all machines used in the war, and was also required on the home fronts where it was needed to fuel factories. As such, a significant amount was transported from Ceylon to Australia, where it was then manufactured into supplies needed for the war effort in the Pacific, such as tyres, and sent onward to the armies, navies and air forces operating in the theatre. If the Middle Eastern reserves were lost too, the empire would have been limited to sourcing oil products from the Americas. The closure of the Mediterranean sea lanes meant that Britain already had to route all shipping from the Middle East and Indian Ocean theatres to Europe via the Cape of Good Hope. This was a much longer route that tied up shipping for longer periods, and it soon became unsustainable. As such, Britain had been supplied by American oil for much of the war, but the Allies did not have the naval shipping capacity to supply the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East from America as well, let alone the financial capacity. This was acknowledged by the Oil Control Board in Britain, which reported that if the Middle Eastern position was lost, it did not have the extra 200 ships required to make the journeys. This is only one example, but British High Command was demonstrably aware of the interconnected nature of the war. Maintaining this logistical worldwide web was the key to survival. It was what allowed the Allies to fight through the dire years between 1941 and 1943, waiting for America to come into the war. And the debasing of this network in any one sector had a flow-on effect. In this example, the loss of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies had significant implications for the global war effort and amplified the importance of operations in distant theatres, both directly and indirectly. The loss of Ceylon would have provided a springboard for assaults on India and other areas of the Indian Ocean theatre, the demographic heartland of the British war effort, and stripped the empire of its most significant rubber source. This in turn would have threatened to isolate the armies within the Middle East and Mediterranean theatres, interdicted shipping between the Middle East, Australia and the Pacific, and severely impacted not only Australia's war capabilities in general, but also Britain's ability to aid the war in the Pacific. Examples like this demonstrate why Churchill himself took such a grand strategic approach and viewed the war from the perspective of a maritime framework, as maintaining these networks was the key to waging a global war such as this. So I will leave you with this likely familiar proverb, which I think sums up the argument for connectivity and how something which might seem localised can have much larger implications. For want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the rider was lost. For want of a rider, the message was lost. For want of a message, the battle was lost. And for want of the battle, the kingdom was lost. And all for want of a horseshoe nail. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Historical truth for an old proverb. And indeed, a very cogent reminder of how interconnected theatres in a global war can be very important in that respect, and how there are truly global implications for local operations. Our next speaker is Honae Cuffe, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales, and her current research concerns Australian foreign policy, Australian relations with great powers and with regional states.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the Sea Power for the very lovely invitation to come and speak today. So there has been a tendency among historians to dismiss Australian defence planning during the interwar years. Australia's efforts were, according to the official war historian Paul Hasluck, modest and lagging in organisation. This was largely the result of a chronic lack of self-reliance, as the government could, according to David Day, see no alternative to historic reliance on Britain. Australia's disillusionment and its so-called Great Betrayal was not revealed until February 1942, with the fall of Singapore. Now, while it is true that the Singapore naval strategy was ill-fated and Australia's rearmament efforts were modest, this assessment too readily dismisses the nation's agency in policy-making. Today, by way of contrast, I want to explore Australia's apprehension surrounding the Singapore strategy and the government's efforts to rearm for local defence needs in a bid to offset the problems of imperial defence plans for the Asia-Pacific. I'll focus on a particular episode, the 1934 Defence Review undertaken by the Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defence, Maurice Hankey, and the Australian rearmament program that was developed in response. In focusing on this episode, I want to underscore Australia's keen appreciation of its particular geographic security challenges and efforts to balance naval contributions to local and global security. The Singapore strategy has been dealt with in length elsewhere and does not bear repeating in detail today. I do, however, want to briefly draw attention to the reservations of some key Australian policymakers. So, although the base was proposed in 1919 and approved in 1921, a succession of political backflips meant that the construction at Singapore did not begin until 1923. The result of this indecision was that by 1929, which marked the end of the initial 8-year construction timetable, the project was far from complete. All there was to show was one floating dock and a handful of incomplete, smaller structures. Australian Prime Ministers William Hughes and Stanley Melbourne Bruce, both mindful of the delays in initial construction, questioned the British government on the logistics of the Singapore strategy. Each received the same bland reassurances that Singapore would be finished, fully garrisoned, and the RN would arrive. This led Bruce, somewhat unconvinced, to remark, quote, "I am not quite clear as to how the protection of Singapore is to be assured. I am quite clear on this point. Apparently it can be done." Australia's anxiety was exacerbated by increasing tensions in Europe and the Far East, which added credence to the likelihood of a two-ocean war in the near future. This tension was chiefly evidenced in Germany's withdrawal from the League of Nations, the Manchurian crisis, and Japan's subsequent decision to withdraw from the League. This was not helped by the British government's acknowledgements of the inadequacy of its recent defence planning. In February 1932, the annual review of the Chiefs of Staff for the Committee of Imperial Defence was released. The review criticised the 10-year rule and its impact on British armed power. So that was Britain's assessment that defence expenditure could be greatly reduced as there would be no major conflict in the 10 years following the end of the First World War. So the CID was particularly concerned with the situation in the Asia Pacific. The situation was deemed, quote, about as bad as it could be. On the advice of the CID, the 10-year rule was cancelled. Despite the cancellation, the Australian government was cautioned that the continuing economic burden wrought by the Great Depression would not permit greater defence commitment to the Pacific, with work at the Singapore base continuing but not intensifying. In October 1933, the CID annual review again criticised defence planning, commenting that despite escalating international tensions, no guiding principle has yet been established to replace the 10-year rule. The review concluded that a new principle for British defence policy was required immediately. The Australian government, having viewed these reports, invited the CID Secretary Maurice Hankey to visit Australia and compile a review of the current state of Australian and imperial defence and its future needs. In the months between Hankey's invitation in February 1934 and his arrival in the following October, new concerns arose around Australia's strategic vulnerability. Firstly, the Minister for External Affairs, John Latham, who was leading Australia's first regional diplomatic mission, visited Singapore, where he was able to observe firsthand the developments at the base. He labelled these as, quote, chaotic and without concentration. The British government also downgraded the strategic prioritisation of the Asia-Pacific region, which led to a decrease in naval expenditure for the region. A great deal of Hankey's role, therefore, in Australia was to placate the government's fears about Britain's commitments in the Asia-Pacific. Hankey's report shows that he was highly critical of Australia's invasion anxiety and plans for a military organisation designed to resist invasion, deeming these extreme and fatalistic actions. His report advocated for the Singapore strategy and the capacity of the Royal Navy to maintain its role as the shield of the whole empire. According to Hankey, provided that the British fleet arrives in time and finds a properly equipped base at Singapore, Australia has nothing to fear beyond sporadic attack. He concluded that the basis of Australian defence going forward should be a strong navy with a focus on the continuation of the Blue Water Naval Strategy and symmetry in Australia and Britain's operations design. Hankey's report received a mixed response in Australia. RAN staff unsurprisingly embraced his recommendations as they preserved the strategic prioritisation of the Navy when it came to government expenditure. Conversely, the commander of the Royal Military College, Lieutenant General John Laverack, himself annoyed by the prioritisation of the Navy above the armed forces and Hankey's suggestion that the Army be reduced in size, observed that Hankey's views are out of date, since they do not sufficiently take into account the decline of British sea power which has taken place since the war. In December 1935, Minister for Defence Archdale Parkhill announced a new defence program for the years 1935 to 37. This was largely in response to Hankey's report. The Lyons government undertook an ambitious plan for naval expansion and modernisation, including the procurement of a flotilla of V and W class destroyers, 2 1,000-ton sloops, and the refitting or replacement of 5 cruisers. The close-range anti-aircraft artillery fitted to the new and upgraded cruisers would be particularly useful in defending against airborne coastal raids. To this end, the new defence plan also allocated significant funds to the expansion of the Royal Australian Air Force. The mobility of aircraft was crucial in coastal reconnaissance, and the Australian government had a vision for greater air-sea cooperation in the open seas and in Australia's waters. The nature of this program suggests that the Lyons government was not entirely convinced by Hankey's faith in the Singapore strategy, nor his indifference to coastal raids. The program was a carefully executed compromise on Hankey's report that aimed to meet Australia's commitments to forward naval deployment as a contribution to the global imperial effort, and in turn this acknowledged the role of the RN as the safeguard for Australian security, whilst also allowing provisions for home defence. That the Australian government was seeking to develop a more self-reliant, region-specific defence posture was tacitly acknowledged in Parkhill's speech detailing the new program. He stressed the importance of Australia maintaining, quote, its own resources, particularly so as not to be forced to rely on overseas sources which might not be available in time of war. Planning and strategising directed towards local defence was not necessarily contradictory to the Blue Water naval policy, nor at the expense of imperial efforts. It was, however, indicative of the Australian government's misgivings about imperial defence planning for the Asia-Pacific region, in particular fears about the completion of Singapore before the outbreak of hostilities and the prolonged delay in the arrival of the RN. Cabinet archives indicate that these particular concerns had been voiced in the months preceding the announcement of the new rearmament program. Granted, neither Australia's 1935 to 37 rearmament program nor the efforts that followed prevented the fall of Singapore or remedied the great powers' assessment that the Pacific theatre was of secondary importance in the Second World War. Nevertheless, the Hankey report and the subsequent rearmament program remain a significant episode in Australia's defence history. They draw attention to an agency in Australian policymaking during the 1930s that is so often overlooked, as the nation critically assessed its future security needs and how best to negotiate commitments to its local and global spheres of interest. Ultimately, I believe this episode goes some way to correct the narrative of a nation that overlooked Britain's waning capabilities, and accepted the Singapore naval strategy without hesitation. I want to end with a brief comment, which I hope might spark some audience questions and reflection on the current international climate in which America faces faltering power in the Asia-Pacific region, and strategists such as Hugh White are encouraging Australia to consider a future in which we may have to defend ourselves independently. As in the 1930s, today maritime power is central to defence. The Australian government is again facing the reality that great and powerful friends are not always insurance policies, and most critically, the government must address the relationship between local defence and broader global security. Thank you.
Thank you, Honae, for that reminder that national policy must negotiate national interests and national allies, as well as between regional and distant priorities. Our next speaker, James Goldrick, will be well known to many of you. James is, of course, a retired Rear Admiral in the Royal Australian Navy. He has held a variety of significant commands in the defence sphere. He's a widely published and leading naval historian and maritime strategic writer. James.
I think you'll all agree that the presentations we've had so far have very much been aligned with the idea about local action and global influence. And I want to touch on this theme in my presentation. I was struck very recently by a banner employed by the Marine Nationale of France, which described itself in English as the world's local navy. And if you examine both the deployment patterns and the capabilities of the units which are customarily deployed to France's overseas stations and go back at intervals over more than 150 years, there's actually a remarkable continuity. The light surveillance frigates of the present Floreal class, which operate around the Indian and South Pacific Oceans, and which are frequent visitors to Australia, bear at least conceptually a remarkable resemblance, and certainly in relative capability, to the colonial sloops of the 1920s and 1930s, and the composite steam and sail corvettes of the late 19th century. And they do much the same work. It may be that with the Type 31 frigate, the Royal Navy is discovering, or at least helping the British government rediscover, the way in which national interests at sea can best be protected. Because the French approach confirms, I think, that the activities of power projection do not necessarily, or even usually, require highly sophisticated combatant units capable of high-intensity warfare. Indeed, because historically and in the contemporary world, so much of the action and influence effort involves operations other than war, or at least operations other than high-intensity fleet combat. Both diplomatic and constabulary operations, and indeed a good number of war operations, put a premium on capabilities additional to those needed for high-intensity combat, perhaps the most important of which are those which provide what we can describe in maritime doctrine as persistence, but to which I'd add adaptability. Now, as an aside, and this is a particularly important point I want to make, and arguably Jeff Till has beaten me to it in a sense with his comment on what anti-access area denial by replacing the term sea denial seems to deny us the ability to go and look at the experience of the past, is that we need as maritime people to insist on a much more careful and close definition of the term non-traditional security threats. I have a cynical view that the term was coined by land-based Cold War think tankers who'd made their living before 1991 pondering nuclear deterrence and war on the Central Front as part of their effort to make a living in the post-Cold War environment. The truth is that many of the non-state-based threats to the maritime domain are highly traditional, often as old as humanity's organised use of the sea. Piracy, smuggling, and as an aside, I've often felt that some of the free traders in the Northwest Indian Ocean who've been boarded by the ships of the War Against Terrorism Task Force would have a right to go to the International Court of Justice to complain about interference with their traditional smuggling rights. But slave trading and illegal fishing all have their own extensive histories, as do the efforts of the world's navies against them. My point, and this really follows from Jeff Till's comment, is that labelling such things as non-traditional has three inimical effects. The first is that by effectively ignoring the way in which the history of navies is inextricably linked with such operations, it creates a tendency to delegitimise the contemporary place of navies in these parts of the spectrum of conflict. In this context, I'd add that the artificial exclusion of the United States Navy from so much constabulary work through the existence of the admirable United States Coast Guard, which I personally consider as much of a navy as it is a coast guard, and the posse comitatus laws and regulations which exclude the US military from domestic law enforcement do not help. There is a tendency in the English-speaking world to think that the way the Americans operate is sort of the standard. In this case, it's actually the exception. The second, and really I think it's been proven by some of the presentations that have preceded me, and is tied up with a wide span of things that navies need to do even in peacetime, is that it prevents our thinking properly and in context about what naval power does as an element of sea power. Richard Dunley's presentation makes it very clear there is much more to what navies do in war than fleet-on-fleet combat. You could describe, in fact, fleet-on-fleet combat as a necessary but not sufficient capability. For example, both that blockade line off the North American west coast and those bases in the Falklands and other focal areas would have required very large numbers of patrol vessels to actually do their work, however limited the combat capability of many of those vessels. The third point is that generalisations inherent in non-traditional make it much more difficult to identify just what is new and how such novelties must change naval approaches which have so far been proven by experience. The elephant in the room, or let's use a maritime metaphor, the great white shark in the swimming pool, is of course climate change. We are only beginning to understand its consequences, but from a maritime perspective, I would suggest that an early one has been the need to evolve humanitarian assistance from the sea and the multinational arrangements to conduct it from what could be described as an opportunistic capability to a permanent one. While the history of multinational sea-based disaster relief operations goes back well over a century, and I can just give you the example of the Messina earthquake before World War I, we need to be ready to act both individually and in combination on a much greater scale and at much greater speed than ever before, and probably will need to do it much more often. In particular, there can be no surety that major contingencies of this nature will occur in series rather than parallel. Now, although I believe strongly that there is a role for civil maritime security forces, such as that which Australia has within the Australian Border Force, I believe it's important that navies neither devolve too much of the maritime security effort to them, nor too little. But I will say the truth is that the distinction between maintenance of the required security environment and the national interest and law enforcement was never absolute, and it's arguably getting more difficult to make a distinction. There's been much talk of the grey zone and the success of particular nations in using state power at sea by forces which are coastguards or indeed maritime militias rather than navies. But my view is that we've reached a point in 2019 where many of the supposed benefits of de-escalation that are provided by what are called white hulls of coastguards have gone. Coastguards have been used in such a way by particular nations, in my view, as to delegitimise coastguards. Now, I stress I'm not saying that navies need to be designed primarily to manage the operations required for the maintenance of maritime security or the operations that have been talked about for trade control. The truth is that the ability to undertake such work depends upon having a credible capacity to deal with higher intensity threats. In other words, the possession of an effective deterrent to a would-be aggressor provides the necessary cover. The SWAT team is available to back up the policeman on the beat. And that effect of cover can be achieved on land as well by the right sort of high capability forces, as Australia's last Governor-General has often testified about the presence of the powerful fleet off Dili during the early days of the multinational intervention in East Timor. So navies need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I couldn't think of a maritime metaphor, but that'll do. And this is where clear thinking will be required about the management of the balance between capabilities and, just as important, the maintenance of the balance between activities. And this is an area I think we've had a real problem. Because remember, it is activities which actually create expertise, but excessive focus on a particular activity can create, because something drops off unrecognised and unobserved, deficiencies in other key skills. And we have only to consider the effect of post-Cold War maritime security operations on the anti-submarine warfare skills of the navies of the West that we're struggling to recover even now. We thus need combatants, and we need patrol and surveillance units, and we need both in sufficient numbers. And to refine it further, and probably the thing we should be putting in front of the actual ships, is we need enough expert, suitably qualified, trained and experienced personnel to do both and to do other things. Because when you look around at the world's navies of the West, the navies of the West at the moment, what's limiting operational capability is people much more than it is platforms. If I could finish with a final point, the historical experience and the contemporary reality both indicate that for maritime nations with extended responsibilities, size has a benefit all its own, range endurance and capacity matters, but so do sufficient numbers. In the emerging strategic environment, both are likely to matter even more than they have in the past. Thank you.
James, thank you for that helpful reminder of the enduring applicability of the wide spectrum of naval operations and, by implication, of the relevance of history. We have time for a few questions, I think, and the first one is directed to Nick Childs and David Kohnen with reference to the Southwest Pacific during the period between 1942 and 1945 and the Royal Navy in the Falklands War. What is the significance of commercial shipping for logistics support in today's environment?
John?
Well, I think it's absolutely a critical potential discontinuity, particularly in terms of being able to adapt to and sustain capabilities in the future in terms of high end. Clearly, I think we both sort of referred to Ernest King's scepticism about the ability of the Royal Navy to transition from a reliance on land-based operations that were focused on Europe to a Pacific-orientated fleet train operation, and the efforts that went into the transformation were considerable. They weren't. They had effect, but they also had enormous limitations. One of the critical elements to the Falklands operation was the inventory of mercantile shipping that could be taken up from trade to deliver a sustainable and sustaining capability over very long distance. The issue today is that the capability in terms of scale, both as far as combatants is concerned, but particularly in terms of industrial base and the ability to transform, to take up ships from trade and then to transform them into what you want, is minimal, approaching non-existent, and I think that's a critical element.
So one of the very first orders that King issued when he received the responsibility, if not the authority, as Commander U.S. Fleet, was to Nimitz, saying, keep the lines of communication to Australia open. That was critical to the Europe First strategy. And what King's perspective was in 1942 was we have to establish the means to mobilize the industrial resources of the United States. And so that period of 1942 is really a period of compromise in terms of strategy. And the quotation that I gave you from Winston Churchill about logistics comes out of the July conference. And Winston was doing his thing and saying, let's go to Norway, let's go to the Mediterranean. Hey, why not? Let's go to Hong Kong. And King said, you can't do it. We don't have the ships. It's a simple matter of logistics. To which Churchill replied in the way that I shared with you. The interesting thing that I think is that we can all draw from in history is that just 100 years ago, the United States Navy was a minuscule force, really. It was an interesting force that was on the rise. And in many respects, when you're a small Navy on the rise, perhaps you're maybe more creative than a big Navy that is set in its ways, which not for attribution, and my opinions are not those of the United States Navy. I would say that the United States Navy is more analogous today with the Royal Navy of 100 years ago than the U.S. Navy of 100 years ago. I would say that another problem that we face, and we are talking about it in the United States, is the role of the MSC, the Merchant Auxiliary Navy, which is critical to any future conflict. I think King would tell you right now that we should reestablish a merchant marine capability along the same lines that Roosevelt went to great lengths to establish before the Second World War. one final quote, observation. It's really important, I think, to understand that the Second World War was not a foregone conclusion from the American point of view. If you look at the American strategy from 1937 to 41, American strategy was a strategy of neutrality, and it was designed to support the British Empire and other global friends as much as possible. Roosevelt's desired end state, however, was not the restoration of imperial order. It was this idea of a United Nations, which is a great idea on paper, but in practice requires a lot of work to make it work. And I would challenge us, future thinkers, to try and think about how we could make it work in the future a little better than it has since at least the Cold War era.
Our next question is for Dr. Richard Dunley. Was mine warfare considered in the case study you presented, and in what context?
Yes, they did look at mine warfare in a number of sort of different ways, partially a sort of defensive, but also offensive mine laying capability. The real issue was that to get the mines into the places where they would be sort of most useful, you had to actually go into Japanese home waters. And there were plans to deploy mine-laying submarines to lay mines off the Japanese ports, but mine-laying submarines have very limited capacity, and even if they're operating from Hong Kong, you're still talking a distance of over 1,000 miles to most of these Japanese ports. So it's a seriously long way to be dropping sort of 10, 12 mines at a trip. So they are looking at this, but they don't really have the capability to be able to employ it on a major scale in the way that they looked at doing before the First World War. Because mines do give you an excellent legal out in terms of how you can target trade without having to say that you're targeting trade. And a way around the international law problems that they were considering.
Our next question is for Honae and Nicole. And the question is, are there means of affecting a modern Singapore-type strategy, more or less, in a world today which revolves around e-commerce and interconnectedness?
I guess it's a little bit different today from what I can think of now, in that part of the thing with the Singapore strategy was it wasn't necessarily just about keeping people an offensive sort of capability and whatnot. It was about defending what was behind. It's about defending the Indian Ocean and whatnot. So in that sense, it was an imperial strategy. It wasn't what it is now, where you've got local players, individual nations. You don't have that same kind of joint venture that has a interest in that sort of defence. So Australia is more, from what I've been reading in my own research, it's more a local defence. It's protecting Australian sea lanes and communications and whatnot across the Indian Ocean, across to the Pacific, but it's not necessarily the same sort of strategy, I wouldn't think.
Yeah, I have to agree. On sort of the contemporary lines of communication in a globalised world, I don't know, maybe there's the potential for like a, now I've forgotten the word, virtual Singapore strategy?
Cyber.
Yeah, like a cyber Singapore strategy, joint venture, I don't know, but yeah, it definitely was, from the Australian perspective, very much a local defence operation.
Thank you. Our next question is to Honae. Were Australia's concerns during that period driven by funding shortfalls or service parochialism?
I think a little of both. Because, yeah, I think sort of both aspects, I'd have to say.
Our next question is to Nicole. Are there primary sources worth reading with reference to the protection of critical resources?
Yes. In my research, I've gone through files in Australian archives, British archives, and US archives. All of them contain material on these sort of aspects. So the British archives particularly, the main, and Australian as well, the main theme of it is oil, fuel, petrol, aviation, gasoline, naval fuel. Where they get it from, do we have enough of it? And throughout the war, the Australian government is constantly crying out, saying we don't have enough oil. We need more petrol, we need all these things. And Britain's on the other side saying, we need it ourselves, we don't have enough. At one point, they had less than 5 weeks of oil supplies in Britain. And so that's a constant concern, and there's lots of diplomatic materials, economic materials going back and forth between the UK and Australia. And in turn, with the US supplies coming in as well for the Pacific, there's memorandums, messages going between the US, Australia, and the US and Britain saying they want more fuel and rubber sent to Australia and the Pacific because they need it as well. They need to build up these supplies, and this is important. So there's lots of material there from different key players, John Curtin, Robert Menzies, whatnot. But yeah, it is definitely there.
Our next question is to Rear Admiral James Goldrick. What role does the new generation Navy sailor or officer play with regards to diplomacy within the Indo-Pacific region?
That really works out. That's a question that's got several answers. One is the representative of Australia, individually and collectively, that our officers and sailors are when they're interacting with other countries, and they can send a very important message about culture and about attitude. A more specific professional point is that the quality of the individual and collective also demonstrates, presents a message about both Australia's resolve and its capability. Professionalism creates an effect, and it's an effect which can be deterrent, it can be reassuring, it can be many other things. And finally, it is also the effect of their quality, again individually and collectively, on our relationship with the other organisations, and it's not just navies, nor is it simply defence forces, it's also all the countries that in the South Pacific that don't have a navy may have a police force. It's all those other entities which share for their nations the same responsibilities. So both that surety of professionalism and attitude can both help in itself, but also create an attitude about what Australia is and what Australia promises and what Australia can fulfil.
Thank you. We're out of time now, but a number of the other questions we may be able to move forward, carry them forward to the later panel session. I'd like to do two things now. The first is to thank our panel collectively for what I'm sure you will all agree has been an authoritative and very stimulating session. Thank you all very much. The second thing I would like to do now is pass on the baton to John Perryman, who's going to introduce the Chief of Navy and proceed with the book launch. Thank you all very much.
Right, so we're just going to take a moment now to have the panel seated at the front here and just await the arrival of the Chief of Navy, and then we'll be proceeding the break with a book launch. So I just ask you to sit quietly for the next few moments until the Chief of Navy arrives, then we'll go with the book launch, and then we'll be going to this afternoon's break. Thank you very much. One of the nice things about working at the Sea Power Centre and heading up history is that every now and again we have a young sailor come through who shows great potential, and we've been very, very fortunate to have one of those come through in the last 18 months, able Seaman Libby Pearce. And it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to introduce the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Mike Noonan, to officially launch the book that Libby put together during her time in the Navy's history section. To my reckoning, this is probably one of the first times that a female able seaman has written a book. But over to Vice Admiral Noonan now to officially launch the book. Thank you, sir. Very much appreciated.
Thanks, John. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being here for what is, I would say, one of the most pleasurable parts of the Sea Power Conference thus far. I'd like to make a special welcome to Neil and Lisa, Libby's mum and dad, who've travelled to be with us today, while you're on holidays, no less. But as I look across the crowd here, there's a lot of familiar faces, a lot of people who understand more about the history of Australians' corvettes than I do, and I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Rear Admiral Guy Griffiths, who's with us today, a living legend of our Navy. Sir, thank you for being with us. This morning, I've been engaged in a lot of conversations around where our Navy's going, and I've spoken a lot about shipbuilding and the importance of the focus that we have as we grow our relationship with industry and with academia. And it's not ironic, it's absolutely appropriate that an able seaman in our Navy has seen the opportunity to capture the story of our Bathurst-class frigates and write in pictures about the history of these great ships. Built between 1940 and 1944, these corvettes carried the names of many of our Australian towns and cities. They were built largely by Australians who'd never built ships before, and largely crewed by reservists of our Navy, and they did incredible things during those very important years of our Navy's history. And Libby, through her research and through her eye for detail, has put together this magnificent book, The ABC of the Royal Australian Navy Corvettes. And it's my absolute pleasure to officially launch it with you, Libby, today. I'm not going to steal any more of your thunder, but this is the sort of thinking that I want to see in the young people in our Navy. This is the sort of commitment that I want to see from each and every one. And this is the challenge that I put out to the future generations of our Navy's men and women, to capture those parts of our history from which we will learn as we go forward into the future. And it's my absolute pleasure to join you today, Libby, in the launch of this magnificent book. Thank you for your great work. And I have a small presentation for you. And if you'd like to come forward, you might have to bring mum or dad up as well, because it's not quite that small. This is the original artwork for the cover of your book, which has been donated by the artist. It's beautiful, isn't it? It is. Congratulations. Okay, if I can have the microphone back. And now we really do need the assistance of you, Neil, please, because I'm running out of hands here. Because I've now got another presentation for Libby, and I'm the only person that can read this out because it's a Chief of Navy commendation. You weren't expecting that. And I would love to read this to all of you here today. This is to Able Seaman Libby Anna Pearce of the Sea Power Centre Australia. I commend you for your exemplary performance in discharging your duties and responsibilities as the webpage supervisor in the Navy History section of the Sea Power Centre Australia. Your commitment, enthusiasm and diligence in placing the history and achievements of the Royal Australian Navy in the public domain have contributed significantly to promoting the understanding and achievements of our Navy and enhancing its reputation. In doing so, you have improved your own knowledge of our Navy's rich history and have sought innovative ways in which to share this with others. The publication of your book, The ABC of the Royal Australian Navy's Corvettes, comes at a time when the Navy and the nation are creating the next generation of Australia's warships, and it reminds us of the close historical links that our Navy has fostered with the people and the towns and cities of Australia since inception in 1901. Your dedication and achievements are in the keeping of the finest traditions of the Royal Australian Navy and the Australian Defence Force. Bravo Zulu, and thank you, Libby. And I suspect that any prepared words that you had, Libby, might now need to be rejigged as you reorder how you might think. But if you'd like to say a few words, you'd be very welcome.
Thanks, sir. I have to say firstly that I never thought in my career that I'd be standing in front of all my peers, in front of Admiral Noonan, in front of my family, presenting a body of work that I am so proud of. So I started working in the history section of the Naval, the Sea Power Centre Australia in January 2018, and I have to admit my understanding of naval history was very limited. I was in the role of updating the Navy's history pages online, and one of my first tasks, which John Perryman gave me, was to update the pages of the Royal Australian Navy's Bathurst-class corvettes in World War II. It was quite daunting as there was 56 ships in that class, 60 were built and 4 were given to the Indian Navy, all in Australia. And I started looking at the images, reading their stories, and I was getting quite curious and I wanted to know more. So luckily I have had a great team at the Sea Power Centre, John, Peter Djokovic and all the other staff. I just kept asking questions. I wanted to know, where did the camouflage paint scheme come from? Why were there pictures of personnel wearing different uniforms at sea? And more importantly, where could I find more information? I just wanted to know pretty much everything there was to know about the Corvettes, and I would pester and tell anyone that would really listen about, may it be what the mascots were on the ships. On Kiama, they had a chicken. Well, actually, they had 2, which is something that not many people know. The CEO at the time wanted fresh eggs every day, so he asked one of the able seamen to go ashore with 2 pounds and turned the spud locker into a chicken coop. They also had a parrot, I believe, but it's those stories that I was interested in. I wanted to know more because if we don't look back, we can't really move forward. So I wanted to show in this book what I saw every day, those interesting images. And I think because today's people are more digital, it's easy to show it through pictures. So I spent many hours editing these, and I hope you enjoy their stories as much as I do. Thank you.